Hello everyone, I'm delighted to welcome you to the event this evening associated with the Silk Road exhibitions at the British Museum and the British Library. I'm Susan Whitfield, I'm Professor of Silk Road Studies at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures at the University of East Anglia, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's session. I am joined by three curators, Sue Brunning, Sven Kalmring and Melody Dumi. Each has chosen an object or a subject, group of objects from their exhibitions to discuss. And I'm going to first introduce the speakers. I'll introduce all three of them now, and then I will turn over to them and each will speak in turn for about 15 minutes. We will then have a chance for questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer function, which you can see on your screen. And we'll have some time at the end to raise some of those. It's a great pleasure to be here. And so let me tell you about our three speakers first. Dr. Sue Brunning has a PhD from University College London. She is an archaeologist specializing in early medieval material culture, particularly swords, and is the curator of early medieval Europe collections at the British Museum. She is one of the curators of the Silk Road exhibitions at the British Museum, along with Elizabeth O'Connell and Yuping Luck. Our second speaker is joining us from Sweden. Associate Professor Dr. Sven Kalmring is Senior Curator for the Younger Iron Age and Viking Age collections at the Department of Collections and Research at the National Historical Museums in Stockholm. He is reader at Stockholm University, and his main fields of research are early medieval harbours and Viking Age urbanisation. He has led excavations at the UNESCO World Heritage Sites of Hedeby, Germany, and Berka, Sweden, among many other sites. Our third speaker, Melody Dumi, is lead curator at the British Library for the Chinese collections, Stein and Hernley collections. And she has special responsibility for the international Dunhuang programme. She is a key member of the curatorial team for the British Library's exhibition, A Silk Road Oasis, Life in Ancient Dunhuang, which is also on now and continues for the same time as the British Museum exhibition up until the end, well, 23rd of February next year. Her research focuses on the history of these remarkable collections, their materiality, and the social and religious practices associated with them. So a stellar lineup, and I'm very interested to hear their talks, as I'm sure you are. So let's get on to it. So I'm going to hand over to Sue to talk about her chosen object. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. So here at the British Museum, the Silk Roads exhibition tells a story of connections and exchange across continents, from East Asia to Northwest Europe between the period of around 500 to 1000 CE. Now, Northwest Europe hasn't always been thought of as a part of this story, especially up here in Britain. But at the British Museum, we're incredibly fortunate to hold an assemblage that embodies Britain's place in the wider world during this, in many ways, defining period. And that is, of course, the Sutton Hoo ship burial. Now, this groundbreaking archaeological discovery was the largest burial that was excavated amongst a series of late 6th to early 7th century mounds, large earth mounds at the site of Sutton Hoo, which is located near the modern town of Woodbridge in the county of Suffolk over in eastern England, as you can see here on the map. And it really does remain the most spectacular intact burial that we have from this period in Europe. And it was probably the resting place, final resting place of a king of the local kingdom of East Anglia at that time. Now, the burial was laid out in a chamber on the deck of a 27-metre long ship. You can see one of the excavation photographs from 1939 here, and many people think that the ship actually did survive in the ground, but what you're actually looking at is the imprint of the ship in the soil at Sutton Hoo, and the small dots that you can see running along the length are the original iron rivets, which did survive and remained in their original positions where they kind of fixed the planking together. Now, inside the ship were a number of objects that were linked to places both near and far. As you can see on this map, that gives you an impression of where those objects came from. So we have items that most likely were made in Britain and Ireland to the west, have particular links to Scandinavia in the north, and as far east as the Byzantine world and beyond, into Syria, perhaps also into Mesopotamia, and maybe into Central Asia as well. And research by some of my colleagues here at the British Museum has expanded this map via research in recent years. Now, the burial itself has challenged the traditional view that early medieval Britain became a somewhat isolated and insular place in the centuries after Roman rule ended. And it showed instead this region to be an outward-looking place that was very well connected to the networks that crisscrossed the world around it. And the object that I'll present this evening is a really dramatic example of these connections. So here it is. It's a shoulder clasp. It's one of a pair of these objects that were found at Sutton Hoo, and it's part of a spectacular wider group of gold metalwork found in the burial. And as you can see in the image here, it's made in two parts that connect together by that rather lovely pin that has an animal's head at the top. And it would have curved around the wearer's shoulder with one half sort of towards the back and one half towards the front. And it most likely secured a garment that was made of some kind of thick fabric. The clasps themselves are, it's thought, possibly local versions of shoulder clasps that were known from the Roman and Byzantine world further east. And they were perhaps intended to kind of project an air of Roman or Byzantine style authority and power for their wearer here in England. So already we have a connection to the wider world, perhaps through a sort of adaptation of a kind of foreign form of dress custom. But the technique used to make the clasps also provides us with another connection to distant lands. It's known as garnet cloisonné, and as you can see by looking at the clasp, it's a staggeringly intricate method that demanded really highly developed creative and technical skills. And in basic terms, the technique involves the setting of garnets, which are this red sort of gemstone that you can see, and sometimes also coloured glass, which you can see the blue areas here are coloured glass. And these pieces are set into a rather intricate network of gold cells that you can see for the little lines around them there. Those are the gold cells that are holding the signs. And beneath each garnet is a waffled gold foil, very thin, which catches the light and reflects it back through the garnet to make it kind of sparkle and glimmer and glow. And the overall effect, as you can see, is a sort of glittering mosaic surface on the object, and it's really perfectly illustrated by the shoulder clasps. Now, the design that we can see on the clasp is particularly ambitious, even among what we have surviving of cloisonné metalwork from the period. So you can see quite clearly the kind of checkerboard patterns in the middle of each clasp half there. And these are alternating red garnets and blue and white millefiori glass. And around these are panels that are filled with these rather lovely interlacing creatures who have these narrow, sinuous bodies made of these tiny, tiny slivers of garnets. And I hope that you can just make out that they have tiny blue glass eyes as well that are so small. They're kind of about the same size as a dot from a felt tip pen. So really tiny, intricate work here. And at the curved end of the clasp, we have a motif that's two overlapping, stylized, powerful boars. And I hope you can make out the best thing to look for is the little blue tusk, kind of towards the left-hand side. You can see one of these. That's the tusk of the boar coming out of their rather stylized head that's in profile. You can then follow its body all the way back to a curly tail far away on the right-hand side there. And that's just in front of a back leg. The sort of blue checkerboard that you can see there is a very large, powerful hip bone for the front leg. And you can just about see the sort of line of tiny garnets along the upper edge, which is the sort of spine of the boar, which I'll come back to a little bit later on. Now, the cloisonné technique that was so perfectly executed by the artisans at Sutton Hoo didn't actually originate in Britain or indeed anywhere nearby. It's thought to have developed much further to the east of Britain in the region of the Black Sea, the Caucasus, or perhaps also into West Asia, maybe during the first centuries CE. And over time, it spread outwards from here, including westwards throughout Europe, as various elite groups adopted and remodeled it to their tastes. And its popularity within this social group may have been inspired by its associations with the powerful Byzantine Empire, where these sorts of gems and jewels were popular. But its use by the wealthy and formidable Huns under Attila, who I'm sure you've heard of, who established a powerful realm in Central Europe during the 5th century, is thought by some to be an alternative source of inspiration. But in any case, the cloisonné technique had reached Britain by around the 6th century, and it grew popular here among the elite groups as well. So garnet cloisonné, as you can see, is a really fascinating example of how techniques and knowledge and ideas could travel along Eurasia's many networks. Now, the materials used to make the shoulder clasps were also travelers along these networks. So first of all, the gold would have been obtained most likely by recycling coins that had arrived either from Francia, so the region of what is now France, Germany, the Low Countries, or perhaps even further away from the Byzantine Empire, focused on the Eastern Mediterranean. But new scientific analysis that we were able to undertake for the Silk Road show, we looked at the garnets, and this showed that they, meanwhile, had an even longer journey than the gold may have done. Research on other garnet cloisonné finds from England and the near European continent has used various scientific analytical techniques to trace the garnet inlays geographically to various sources that range from Northern Europe all the way down to Southern Asia. And the chart that you can see here shows some of the major geographical groupings that have been identified as a result of this research. But the garnets from the Sutton Hoo ship burial had never been provenanced successfully using scientific analysis, and the Silk Roads exhibition gave us the opportunity to try this. So thanks to some funding that I was able to get from a research consortium called Hyperion HS, I was able to take these 6 objects from the burial to the National Centre for Research and Restoration in French Museums, or C2RMF for short, which is located in Paris, very near to the Louvre Museum. And it's a leading research laboratory and centre for a type of analysis known as PIXI analysis, which stands for particle-induced X-ray emission. And this is the preferred non-destructive, the opposite of that, non-destructive technique for provenancing garnets. PIXI uses a particle accelerator, rather dramatically, to fire a high energy ion beam into each garnet. And this, in basic terms, causes the garnets to sort of emit fluorescent X-rays, and these reveal the garnet's chemical composition. And then this composition can then be compared to a reference collection of garnets that have been gathered from around the world, and where you find a match between the garnet that you're looking at and the reference collection, then you start to have an idea of where the garnet may have come from in the world. Now, you can see the particle accelerator on the slide here. It's known as AGLE, and it's pretty jaw-dropping. As you can see, it fills an enormous space in the basement at C2RMF. And I think that rather fittingly, AGLE's sort of length is listed as 27 meters, which is the same as the Sutton Hoo ship, which is a rather nice kind of mirror there. And of course, the metalwork from Sutton Hoo looked extremely tiny in front of the detectors at C2RMF. So you can see that on the slide here. Each object was carefully positioned on a platform in front of the ion beam, and the operators at C2RMF, an engineer named Quentin Lemasson and a senior researcher, Dr. Thomas Caligaro, returned to the adjacent computer room after fitting the objects in front of the beam, and they watched a live feed from the room there. You can see this on the right-hand photo. And they used a computer to move the ion beam using a white kind of dot, which was from a guiding laser, in order to find the right garnet that we wanted to analyze. And this was very painstaking and time-consuming work because some of these garnets are just millimeters across. They then returned to the particle accelerator, and they hit the firing button and made a safe but rather hasty retreat out back into the computer room where they were able to see the data coming through from the garnets. And my role in all of this was to mark which garnets had been analyzed by numbering them in sequence on a photograph. And this is the diagram that I made in real time during the analysis. And it shows, gives you an impression of how tired my eyes were at the end of those very long days. So while the setup took some time, the data actually came through almost immediately as the ion beam hit each garnet. We had a graph that popped up on the screen in the computer room, and this revealed the chemical composition of the stone. And you can just about see those charts in the background on that right-hand photograph. And Kontan and Thomas, who have analysed a minimum of thousands and thousands of these garnets, could actually estimate the garnet's likely origin just based on the shape of the graph. So that was fascinating to witness. And the preliminary results that came through indicated that all 6 objects were decorated with garnets that had come from 2 continents. So first of all, not so far afield from Czechia in Central Europe, but also we had rather further away results from South Asia, specifically in India, and also as far away as Sri Lanka. Now, this was to some degree expected because the accelerator at C2RMF had also identified very similar stones several years earlier amongst the Staffordshire hoard, which is another major assemblage of this golden garnet cloisonné metalwork, which is contemporary with Sutton Hoo, and some pieces may even have been made in the same workshop. But it was also expected because I deliberately chose objects from the burial that had different looking garnets, often with different shades, different colours. So in other results, these have been shown to have come from different geographical regions. So I wanted to know if this was the case with the garnets from Sutton Hoo as well. And the metalworkers at Sutton Hoo apparently exploited these different colours, different properties that these different garnets had. So on the shoulder clasp, the maker used very large kind of purple red stones to fill the bodies of the boars, which I hope you can see on here. And the Pixie analysis linked these garnets to a source in India in the region of Rajasthan, which was known for supplying high quality garnets at this time. And these very deeply hued garnets were contrasted with the tiny paler orange red garnets along the spine, which I hope you can make out there. And these were provenance to Czechia and Sri Lanka, which was the case with most of these smaller garnets on these objects that we analysed. And so I wondered whether perhaps the maker chose the paler garnets for the spines because they give the impression of finer hair, such as the bristles that we see standing up on the backs of these boars in real life. So just to wrap up, the shoulder clasp from Sutton Hoo, along with the other cloisonné metalwork from the burial, represents a really wonderful marriage of ideas that have come from one place and materials that have come from somewhere else, where they were adopted and adapted somewhere else entirely into something new. And they're really fascinating examples of the complexity and innovation that came from cultural exchange across these overlapping, far-reaching networks that we may call the Silk Roads more than 1,000 years ago. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sue, for that fascinating glimpse. I just love the way, as you said, that one small item can just open the window into a wider world. For any of the audience who've joined us during Sue's talk, just to say we're taking questions right at the end of the 3 talks. So please put any questions in the question answer box and we'll come to them at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome our second speaker, who's also going to talk about one of the objects in the exhibition, Dr. Sven Kalmring. Sven, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. First, I would like to thank the organizers for having me, and thank you. Good evening, everybody. I was invited to talk about the Helgö Buddha, which is one of the really iconic artifacts we have on display, usually in Stockholm. Right now, it's on the Splendid exhibition in London. And it's not very often that this little guy goes traveling. And I checked when Susan came with a request on borrowing this item, and it was on loan last time, some 30 years ago, in connection with an exhibition from the European Council on Vikings and Crusaders, which was shown in Paris, Berlin, and Copenhagen. So 30 years later, it's on display in London, and we're very happy for that. The Helgö Buddha, even in Stockholm, is, as I said, one of the highlights we have in our exhibition. Here you can see a picture of our museum, the Swedish History Museum, and it's part of our permanent exhibition, The Viking World, which was inaugurated in 2021, right after COVID struck. And even the exhibition, as you can see in the picture down on the lower left-hand side, opens really, among other artifacts, with the Helgö Buddha, and the small introductory section is called Boundless Meetings, where the Helgö Buddha has its place. You can also see the link down below on the lower left-hand side. The whole exhibition, if you're interested, is available on internet digitally. Right. It is called the Helgö Buddha because it was found on a tiny island in Lake Mälaren, which is quite close to Stockholm, as you can see on the left-hand side on the picture. And in this inlake, this massive inlake, we have the small island of Helgö, where the Buddha is found from. You can see it on the right-hand side. That's the island of Helgö we're looking at. You can see that it controls a sound, which is called Sundet, to the left-hand side. And in the far upper right corner, you can see Birka. That's the Viking town of Birka, UNESCO World Heritage Site, which many of you might have came across. So that's the name-giving island where it was found, the Buddha figurine. Here you can see the island once more from the National Registry of Archaeological Sites. And you can see here it's two names given, Lillön and Helgö. And Lillön is Swedish for small island, and that actually was the name of this island until the excavation kicked off. And only then one did some research, and the original place name turned eventually up, which is recorded for 1287, and it's in fact Helgö, which stands for the Holy Island, which you might think is an interesting place name to look further into. On the right-hand side, you can see a picture of the site itself. It's a massive area. It's the eastern part of the island, and you can see that the settlement consists of so-called building groups. So this is dwelling sites and also a couple of cemeteries, and 75,000 square meters large, the site itself. The red square we will turn back to. That's the closer area where the Buddha was found. And to the south of it, we have a hill fort, which is also guarding really the small sound leading further into the lake. The Buddha figurine was discovered already in 1956, and there is a story going around that it was found accidentally. That's not quite true. When you look into the facts, the whole story of the excavations on the island started in 1946, where a owner of a holiday home, the whole area settled by holiday houses, as you can judge by the mailboxes down below. One owner of a holiday home found two small migration period gold spiral rings, as you can see on the picture. And then 5 years later, he found another quite spectacular artifact when he was about to put up a pole for his flagpole on his holiday home, and accidentally came across this Coptic bronze ladle found on the very same spot. And that really led to large-scale excavations going on for more than 20 years between 1954 to 78, and 16,000 square meters of the whole site were excavated since then. And the Buddha was found in the scope of these excavations in, as I said, 1956 in the so-called Building Group 2. We look into that in a minute. The academic discussion of the Helgö Buddha, since it's quite a spectacular find and maybe not really expected to find as far north as in Scandinavia as in central Sweden, has been published widely. And here are three of the main publications which are of interest. The first one is from 62, Douglas Barrett, a former colleague from the British Museum, who wrote here in this periodical about the bronzes from northwest India and western Pakistan. Then in the 80s, Ulrich von Schröder published the Indo-Tibetan bronzes. And then the last publication really is from 2004 by a Swedish colleague, Bo Gyllensvärd, who wrote about the Buddha found at Helgö. So this is the main source of information when you want to read up on this artifact. When we zoom into this artifact, we can state that's really a tiny little thing, in case you haven't been able to see it at the British Museum right now, or else at its home place of exhibition in Stockholm. It is only 84 millimeters high, and it weighs little more than 130 grams only. So it's not a spectacular big artifact, but it doesn't need to be that either, as Sue shown in her nice presentation just a minute ago. What we can state is that we are dealing with a seated Buddha on a lotus flower throne. It's a double lotus flower when you look closer. And it's a so-called, excuse my Hindu, Sakyamuni Buddha seated in a Dhyasana yoga pose. And those of you who do yoga might know this pose by own experience. In terms of production, you can see when you look underneath the artifact that it's a cast piece. It was cast in bronze in one piece, and then it was cast in the cire perdue technique. It is the lost wax technique, and you can see the big hole in the center of the statue when you look from down below. And some ideas have been lifted that it might have served as a reliquary originally. It was cast in a copper alloy, so with a 10% zinc or brass, and there's no traces of tin in the artifact itself. When we move on, we can observe some details, and here we also are touching archaeological sciences and material analysis, which were conducted on the Helgö Buddha. You can see the cast mark on the forehead is shining silverly, and this is quite right. It's mainly metallic silver. So it's not only bronze, but you have even traces of silver inlays. The eyebrows are a little unclear. There seems to be some dark matter connected in the stripes of the eyebrows. And even the eyes have some corrosion product, which seems to be or appears blue and glassy, so it might point to copper corrosion and the evidence of copper as inlays for its eyes. Even the lips are strongly marked, and it might have been painted due to the chemical composition, but no further information can be obtained. And gold was not employed in connection with this Buddha figurine. In order to place it in the world in terms of provenances and also time-wise, we are bound to stylistical analysis. And we can state that's a seated Buddha, which is typical for the Gandhara and Gupta schools. We can state that the hand gesture is a Vadara Mudra gesture, which is typical for Kashmir, probably appearing from the second half of the 5th century onwards. That's post-Gandhara. We have a robe covering the entire body, which is typical for the Mathura and Gandhara style. So once more, 5th to 6th century eventually. And we have this lotus throne we were addressing already earlier. This double lotus is characteristical for the Swat Valley, which is in Pakistan. So this item seems to belong to the Kashmir group, the Helgö Buddha, which are characterized by heavy and sturdy bodies, round and bloated faces, petals of lotus without stem, and finally, as we've just seen, copper and silver inlays in eyes and lips are very frequent. And the subgroup to this Kashmir group is the Swat Valley group, which is characterized by quite some blackish bronze, not so brassy. They have a uniform treatment of the lotus and a similar design of the throne. All the Buddhas from the Swat Valley are displayed in a seated fashion. And now I think that's quite interesting. They also tend to have an additional star-like crown, some kind of halo, as you can see in the left-hand picture. So that is something which obviously got lost in the way. I need to speed up a little bit. When you zoom in into this valley in Pakistan, the Swat Valley, you can think that's really, really a long way from there to Sweden and to the Stockholm area. But the great thing about maps is really it depends on the map method you're choosing. When you zoom in into maps about the Islamic world from the 7th to the 10th century, and that's a picture or two pictures I borrowed from the fine catalog to the current exhibition. You can see that's really been found on the outskirts, on the eastern outskirts of the Arab world. And we know, at least from the Viking period, that there were quite intense contacts between Scandinavia, particularly Sweden, and these areas. So it's not so strange, maybe, that this Buddha statue showed up in the middle of Sweden. And we go back to the fine context, it's really interesting. It's been found in building group 2, as I mentioned earlier, 2-1 to be more precise, and it's very characteristical that you have house terraces where big halls have been built upon in order to elevate them even more and make them more impressive. And this house group you can see on the right-hand side, and I would like you to look at the bottom of the picture, which is the Roman I house. We have a multi-faced dwellings going on. This period is from the later migration period up into the Vandal period, which would be on the continental terminology, the Merovingian period or the Anglo-Saxon period for you guys in Britain. And you can see that the Buddha was found next to the house, on the house platform, which is in fact pity, because that way you don't have a proper context which you can date. It is associated to the house, but there's no proper date for the Helgö Buddha when it ended eventually up in Sweden, probably traveled about in the span about 200 years or so. This house platform and this house has also been called or labeled a center for ritual and cult practices. And that is not only due to the amazing find of the Helgö Buddha, but also the Coptic bronze ladle we've seen earlier on. And it's been marked out on the right-hand side, on the upper part. That's the one to the far right. And even an Irish crozier from the 8th, 9th century, which is the center circle in the picture. And all these make an assemblage which leads to the interpretation that this is actually a center for ritual and cult practices. And also makes the assumption on the dating when the Helgö Buddha from the 6th century ended up in the soil in Sweden. Coming up into my last slide, really, what is fun is to look even closer into the Helgö Buddha. It has obviously a biography of its own, 200 years. We can state that there are holes at the back of the head and the elbow, and that's probably damages from castings, which were covered by some copper sheets, as you can see. Then we have another small sheet on the back of the small Buddha figurine, which might be a trace for a cast halo, which was lost on its way. The hand of the Buddha, that's the yellow marker, has been bent over, intentionally or not, that might be a question. And then finally, we get to the Holy Grail of the Helgö Buddha research, and it's still large. It's pieces actually of a leather thong, which was wrapped around its neck and hand when it was discovered. And that would be perfect for archaeological science and a proper dating. So we are still looking intensively for that artifact in order to one day be able to date the Buddha closer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven. I think it just shows, as you said, how much we have yet to understand about these objects and their journeys along the Silk Roads. Okay, to get on with our third presenter, Melody Dumi, who's going to talk not just about a single object, but about a collection of objects moving further east into the Tarim Basin. Melody, over to you.
Hi, good evening. Yes, I'm taking you to the eastern end of the Silk Road, so all the way to Dunhuang. And so I'll start by giving you in the first slides a bit of more context around, yes, a cache of documents that was found near Dunhuang and was, like the Sutton Hoo, a bit of a watershed moment for archaeology. So just to locate Dunhuang and the Silk Road, so the city is located in the present-day northwest China, so province of Gansu. And it's a town that lies in an oasis, so where the Gobi Desert in the west and the eastern edge of the Taklamakan deserts meets. And so it was really one of the ancient world's most important junctions between the east and the west, and developed as a prosperous agricultural district, which sort of made it a mandatory passageway for travelers either going into central China or people coming from China and venturing into Central Asia. It was really at the intersection of the overland trade routes that are now known as the Silk Roads. And so it became a thriving commercial and diplomatic hub, but also a conduit for ideas, religious beliefs, and cultures. And with the spread of Buddhism, Dunhuang also grew into an important Buddhist worship and pilgrimage node on the Silk Roads. So it might be most famous for the Mogao Caves, which are a very impressive cave site located about 25 kilometers southeast of the town. And this is a very impressive Buddhist site. It's a 2-kilometer wide cliff face carved with hundreds of caves. I'm often asked if they were natural. They're man-made caves, and they were carved for a period of about 1,000 years, from roughly the 4th to the 14th century. And their sizes can vary a great deal. So some caves are small niches, others are large cave temples that could accommodate large groups of people. And about 500 of them are filled with magnificent wall paintings, clay sculptures, all of them also primarily dated from the 4th to the 14th century. So it's in 1987, the Mogao Caves were registered as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for that reason. And we really have here a site that is testimony to 1,000 years of rich cultural and artistic exchanges, but also Buddhist devotion, wealth, and patronage. So now to take you closer to the reason why the caves are also so well known is because of what we call Cave 17, which is the small room that contains a cache of manuscripts and other items that I mentioned right at the beginning of my talk. And this is one of the caves of this Mogao Caves complex. It was discovered by accident in 1900 by a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu, who had established himself at the site a few years prior to that, and had appointed himself the caretaker of the caves. And it was fundraising in order to be able to sort of bring them back to their former glory, so, and also maintain their upkeep. Because in the period that had gone from the heyday of the Mogao Caves till the late 19th century, they had fallen into relative dereliction, and a lot of them were silted by sands. And so according to one of the stories, there are several sort of almost legends around the discovery of the caves. Wang Yuanlu undertook to clear off the sand, blocking the corridor to a large cave temple, which is now known as Cave 16. And as he did, he discovered a crack in the wall of the corridor leading to that cave. And upon checking what was behind the crack, he discovered that there was a small room. It's almost a perfect little cube, that room. It's no more than 3 meters wide and 3 meters high, I'd say, almost. And what was extraordinary about that room is that it was a cache full of manuscripts, printed documents, paintings, textiles, and other artifacts. And it had been sealed up probably at the beginning of the 11th century and had remained hidden for most part of 900 years. And it was originally meant as a memorial shrine for an eminent Buddhist monk known as Wu Hongbian. And so here on that slide to the right, you've got a photograph that was taken in 1907 that shows Wang Yuanlu, the discoverer of Cave 17. Here, if you go to the side, this is the view that you would get through that little entrance. You can now see this is a almost true to life size sculpture representing Hongbian. And you just can catch a glimpse of the small room behind, you know, through that entrance. And on the right is what is quite a well-known photograph taken in 1908, and that represents the French sinologist Paul Perriot in that cave, as it was still, you know, yes, it still contained manuscripts. And so the fact that there were, I mean, the number has varied over the years now. Especially the Dunhuang Academy estimate that there were about 70,000 manuscripts. And the fact that there were so many of those scrolls and poties is why often you may encounter this cave called under the name of the library cave, which is quite an evocative way of referring to the majority of its contents. And so the materials in there date mostly from the 9th to 10th century. So their date ranges from the 5th to about the beginning of the 11th century, but the bulk of those are dated to the later period, so 9th to 10th century. And they cover a really wide range of fields. And because of that, they've really revolutionized our knowledge of the history and cultures of the region. So yes, now I will dive into a little bit more about what the contents of Cave 17 have got to teach us. And first and foremost, I would say that it's really an accidental Buddhist archive. So 90% of the materials relate to Buddhism. So whether they're Buddhist or, tangentially related. So we've got numerous Buddhist texts, so Buddhist scriptures in multiple languages. We also have ritual text, commentaries, and apocryphal works. So by apocryphal works, we mean also Buddhist scriptures, but that were not in the Buddhist canon and entered the Buddhist canon later. In addition to that, and I think it's not one of my bullet points, but there were also a number of economic and legal documents that are associated with local monks and nuns, but also local temples in the region. And finally, also, you know, votive paintings, textiles, and other ritual objects. For instance, we've got paper cut flowers, implements, also some small number of small statuettes that came from Mogao Cave 17. So these materials are basically crucial for our understanding and the spread and development of Buddhism across Asia, as well as religious practices and the religious beliefs of the time. So I'm just going to show briefly two objects. So we've got, for instance, this one, which is currently on show at the British Museum, an absolutely amazing embroidery that's most part of 2.50 meters tall. It's probably one of the most exceptional Buddhist items that were found in Cave 17. And it represents the Buddha. You can see him sort of flanked by two bodhisattvas, and a little bit further at the back, you can see his two disciples, Kashyapa and Ananda. So it was previously identified as, the historic Buddha preaching on the vulture speak, and as you will see in the exhibition, is now considered to be a miraculous image of Liangzhou, and it shows the Buddha emerging from a mountain in Liangzhou, which is actually based also in present-day Gansu in the Hexi corridor, so not far at all from Dunhuang. That really speaks of the localization of Buddhism as it, transferred, spread from India. And another really key object I wanted to mention, which is also well known among the items found in Cave 17, is this woodblock printed copy of the Diamond Sutra. So the Diamond Sutra is one of the key scriptures in Mahayana Buddhism, which is really popular, still in China, Japan, and Korea. And what is quite extraordinary about this particular copy is that we know from the dedicatory note at the end, which we call a colophon, we know that it is dated very precisely to the 11th of May 868, and we know it was also commissioned by a certain Wang Tie for universal distribution and on behalf of his parents. So that makes it the oldest complete printed book with a date on it there. Yes, and it's I mean, what you can see, the scroll itself is most part of 5 meter long. Here I'm only showing you a detail of the frontispiece, and the frontispiece is basically this beautiful illustration showing the Buddha preaching among an assembly surrounded by monks. There are also bodhisattvas under a canopy. And you can see, maybe, I hope you can make that from that slide. In the lower left corner, you can see an elderly disciple who is actually kneeling and looking up at the Buddha, engaged in a dialogue with them. And this is Subhuti, with whom the Buddha is actually conversing in the Diamond Sutra. The text itself is the dialogue that unfolds between the disciple and his master, and questions around the illusory nature of all phenomena. So the craftsmanship really required to produce such an item really speaks of a well-established and established printing technology at the time, especially the very refined design. You would have needed the skills, the joint skills of a very talented artist, but also for the text that follows, good calligrapher, and finding also a very good wood carver who would be able to translate all of that so that it would transpire in the printing process. And so scholars have suggested that for this reason, this item was possibly produced in Sichuan, which was an important printing center. So here you maybe have also a sense of like the journey of items that traveled with people along the Silk Roads. Another important aspect of Cave 17 is that it really is a window into a multicultural world. So Buddhism was very prominent in Dunhuang, but we also see among the items found in the cave that some that really witness the presence of other religions. So that covers, Confucianism, Taoism, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, even Judaism and Christianity. And another really striking thing is that many languages and scripts are covered. So that includes Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Khotanese, Uyghur, and other languages. But also quite strikingly, sometimes you have items that combine several languages, which is really evidence of cross-cultural interaction, and also shows Dunhuang as a vibrant cultural and linguistic melting pot. So here, for instance, we've got the Helgö Buddha, which is written in Sogdian language. Sogdian is a Middle Iranian language. It was the language of the people based in Sogdiana. So yes, you can find out about it in the British Museum Silk Roads exhibition. And this item is on display at the British Library at the moment. So Sogdiana, which is in the region of Samarkand, straddling Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. And the Sogdians dominated trade from roughly the 4th to the 8th century and built a series of outposts from their homeland all the way to central China. And their original religion was Zoroastrianism. So it's one of the world's oldest monotheist faith that centered on an Ahura Mazda, incorporating ancient beliefs, and this is actually one of the holiest Zoroastrian prayers, and it predates any other surviving Zoroastrian scriptures by about 400 years, but also shows how Sogdians also helped with the dissemination of Zoroastrianism all the way to Dunhuang. Here we also have another wonderful item. This one is actually a concertina, so it's an accordion-shaped book that contains the Heart Sutra, written in Sanskrit, but with Chinese transliteration. So if you actually look closer, you can see that you'd have to look at it from the right to the left, and it's written vertically. So yeah, comes from the top down, and you'd have actually, I didn't crop the image terribly well, but you'd have to look at like the Sanskrit to the right, accompanied by the Chinese transliteration, so in alternating columns. And what's really interesting here is seeing how the Sanskrit is normally written horizontally and read left to right, but here it was obviously adapted so that it could also follow the reading direction of Chinese, which is right to left and vertically. So yeah, maybe it was used to, it was definitely used to help read Sanskrit in Chinese, so help people pronounce it. So whether during recitation of these Buddhist texts, or maybe when studying the pronunciation of Sanskrit. But it really shows, as I said, these cross-cultural interactions, and the fact that you can have several languages coexisting on documents. Yes, another fascinating aspect of Cave 17 is that it really is a time capsule of daily life. And because it contained a lot of documents that would otherwise not have survived. So we've got letters, contracts, personal documents, preparatory drawings, and so on. And they really give us glimpses into the experiences of the people who lived or traveled through Dunhuang. And what's really quite extraordinary about it is the range of people that covers. So, you get the poor and the wealthy, the young and the old, but also men and women and monastics, so monks, nuns, or lay people. So it really covers all sorts of groups that would otherwise not be represented. So I'll whiz through. Here we've got, for instance, a document that's written in Tibetan, and that's contracts for scribes. So it gives insight into scribal work. It's dated to the 9th century, and really explains what it was like being a scribe working during the Tibetan occupation of Dunhuang, commissioned by the Tibetan emperor to copy some Buddhist scriptures, but also having to follow some strict regulations. So scribes were accountable for the materials that they use, so for instance, paper, and they could face very severe penalties if any wastage or loss happened on the way. That includes being whipped, for instance. And here we also have a list of scribes, named scribes. What is really interesting is that through their names, you can find out that either they were Chinese or they were of mixed heritage, which is quite an interesting aspect also of life there at Dunhuang. This is also a very interesting document. So it tells us of the darker side of life on the Silk Road, because it's a contract for an enslaved woman dated to 991. And here it shows how a 28-year-old woman named Xianchang was sold for 5 bolts of silk, and that was witnessed by members of the clergy. And you can see following can you see my cursor or not at all? No? Well, so the bit of text slightly to the left when you look at the document, which is shorter, is basically the names of the witnesses, followed by a little their signature, so to sign that they were there when the transaction took place. So that lady was sold by an official who was at the time facing financial difficulties, but it really shows how humans were traded as if they were possessions. And finally, to end on a slightly chirpier note, I thought I could share also another incredibly interesting documents. These are the rules of a women's club, also dated to the 10th century. And here we have 15 women coming together to promote friendship. The document sets out the structures of that club, that association, the rules, and so on. And yes, it's what's also really interesting here is that we know it was led and maybe by a nun, showing how nuns were playing an important part in social life of Dunhuang at the time. So yes, just to conclude and wrap up quickly, these documents are absolutely invaluable record of the cultural, social, religious and economic life in Dunhuang, but more widely also in Central Asia and China. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody, and thank you to all our speakers. Fantastic little glimpse into the complexities of the Silk Roads, which I hope the exhibition does give more of. We just have a time for a few questions, and somebody asks, could the holes on the back of the little Buddha statue be used for fixing it, i.e. in a place such as a shrine?
I believe so. Yes, indeed. There were some holes which were clearly covered to cover some damages from casting, but other holes, I truly believe that there might be traces of fixings. The question is if that's from a shrine in Pakistan or was done on the island of Helgö in Sweden, because we have the leather string around the neck and the arm, and you really wonder what they did with this poor little guy on the island.
Okay, well, that leads on to another question, which is what is the significance of the leather, and indeed, where is it now?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, it hasn't been documented since the last conservation report in our museum, but it should be in the collection. So there's just a question of time until we can identify this, and we're working intensively with that. But the big benefit is that we could date it by C14, since it's organic matter, and then we know when people were dealing with the Buddha figurine on site, since we only have this association of artifacts, but no proper context, which really marks it down in time. It produced in the 6th century, dug down in the 8th, 9th, but we don't know exactly. And by that, we could really get closer to that.
Yes, indeed. And have you had chance to go to the Swat Valley to look at other objects and the context there?
Unfortunately not. I would love to. I would love to.
Right. Okay. Well, I know the Italian Archaeological Mission work there, so perhaps you can get an invitation. Okay. Let's see if we can come back to Sue. Sue, are you? Can we hear you now?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
So
yes, just to repeat the question: where was clasp made, and where were the materials sourced? Have you any idea?
Yes, so the gold most likely is from melted down coins, either from just over the English Channel and North Sea into Francia, or alternatively from Byzantine gold coins from the Eastern Mediterranean. So they would have used coins, recycled coins as a gold source rather than it coming from any gold source in Britain at that time, most likely. As I mentioned in the talk, the garnets from those different parts of the world, Central Europe and South Asia. The glass was probably recycled Roman glass rather than anything that was made bespoke for the shoulder clasp. And the whole clasp itself, we think most likely was made in England, most likely in a workshop attached to the royal court of East Anglia at that time. But as I've mentioned, it seemed to draw inspirations from much further afield. So it's this really wonderful kind of marriage of ideas and materials from lots of different places that have kind of come together somewhere else to create something innovative and new.
Yes, absolutely. And another question, somebody asks, how were the garnets cut into such small and intricate shapes? So
very good question. Yes, so garnets will kind of break and sort of shear off in a certain way from the lumps that they come from, but they're probably made particularly more thin, it's thought, by probably using an abrasive, by kind of maybe pasting them down to a kind of a surface and then being able to kind of rub another implement over the top of them to make them more thin. And we see this through using microscopy to look at the surfaces, and we can sometimes see sort of just areas of abrasion where this could have sort of where these areas of abrasion that survived before it was kind of polished up and made nice. So it appears to be kind of perhaps a sort of grinding down, but really there are lots of mysteries about how they were able to create such thin garnets. So we're still learning a bit about that.
Have you done anything, this is a question from me, but I remember years ago when I was looking at a presentation by Oliver Moore, in fact, on Chinese pottery, bronzes, sorry, and he said about trying to make one using old methods.
Yeah. So yes.
Has anything like that been done?
I have a story from somebody else, so it might be slightly apocryphal, but I was told by one of my predecessors that somebody, a modern day artisan who likes to create kind of replicas of or recreations of early medieval metalwork, came to the museum and looked at the shoulder clasps in order to understand better how they were made and to make a version of them. But he, so the story goes, was not able to inlay the garnets onto the curved surface of the clasp, which is very, very difficult if you think of sort of trying to inlay a gemstone, a solid piece, even a very thin piece, on a curved surface and create that beautifully curved and perfectly sort of flush surface. He wasn't able to do that, so instead he resorted to filling the cells with a red resin so that they looked like garnets but were not actually garnets. So it's very difficult, intricate work.
Bit of cheating, but yeah, I think it shows how skilled the craftsmen were. We often think medieval period that people didn't have skills, but it just shows, in fact, they had tremendous skills and lots and lots and lots of practice, obviously. Yes. So yes. Okay, Melody, coming on to you. Somebody says, asks, was the Heart Sutra you showed a manuscript or a print?
Oh, it's manuscript. Yes, it was
Yeah.
probably done using a brush. Looks beautiful.
Yes.
The Gupta script, fine in later printed
Yes.
documents.
And another question is, on the bilingual manuscripts, are there any ways of telling which is the native language of the speaker, of the writer, if you know what I mean? So when you've got a Sanskrit Chinese, is it a Chinese person trying to learn Sanskrit, so writing old Chinese and the Sanskrits in secondhand, or vice versa?
Well, probably depends. There's so many manuscripts in this collection. I don't know. I can only speak of the ones I can think of. When in the case of Sanskrit, when they're very nicely written, it's not always easy. But I guess the main assumption is, well, often they're transliterated, so it kind of hints at the fact that maybe they were not the main language. But you might not see that through the calligraphy itself.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about the Nilakanta Dharani, for instance, that we have in the British Library exhibition, where both are beautifully written. And again, underneath it's Sanskrit and Sogdian, because you get the transliteration, so as a help for recitation.
Yes. And presumably there were speakers of all those languages and writers of all those languages, because these were, as you say, multicultural.
Yes, I think we have people
much
speaking
multicultural
multiple languages too. Yeah.
Yes. So excellent. Okay. Well, I think we're coming to the end of time. So I'm sorry for those who have other questions, but you can always get in touch with the curators directly, or better still, go along to the British Museum and the British Library and see the exhibitions if you haven't seen so already. So thank you everyone for joining us today. The next event in this series is called Istanbul Nexus on the Silk Road, so also very relevant to the current exhibition. And Sue is going to be at that again, along with Bethany Hughes. And that takes place at the museum, British Museum, on Saturday, the 8th of February from 11:30 a.m. And you can look at the museum's website for more information and to book. So I hope you can all make that. And without further ado, just want to say thank you to our three fantastic speakers. And thank you, I would also say, to the craftsmen of old who made these objects so we can all enjoy them and try to puzzle through them today, because as you've all shown, there are still many, many questions to be asked about these before we can really understand them all. So thank you, and thank you to our audience, and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.